Vietnam. This lecture will be an exercise in listening. Please complete the notes as you listen along to this audio clip. I have indicated some of the important terms here that may be difficult to spell that may come up in this lecture. The background of Vietnam. Vietnam was dominated by colonial powers, mainly China and France, for a long time. The Vietnamese fought for independence from France after World War II, and they were led by the communist in this effort, whose name was Ho Chi Minh. The U.S. supported the French because they were concerned that Vietnam would become communist under Ho Chi Minh. The French, however, were defeated at Dien Bien Phu in 1954. Vietnam, as a result, was temporarily divided in 1954, with the North being controlled by communists. The South was run by Ngo Dinh Diem. He was anti-communist. A communist guerrilla-led movement known as the Viet Cong gathered strength in South Vietnam. The U.S. increased aid and sent military advisors to help the government fend off these guerrillas in the early 1960s. So the Viet Cong were basically almost like terrorists, guerrilla groups that were Vietnamese, that were communists, that were working inside South Vietnam, kind of starting guerrilla warfare to try to turn the South more to the communist side. The American escalation, LBJ, standing for Lyndon Baines Johnson, steps up the U.S. involvement in response to Republicans saying he was soft on communism. So when LBJ becomes president, he steps up our involvement. The Gulf of Tonkin Resolution was passed, and it gave the president the authority to take all necessary measures to repel any armed attack against the forces of the U.S. to prevent further aggression. This resolution was the turning point of American involvement in Vietnam because it allowed Johnson to send American forces into combat without seeking a formal declaration of war from Congress against Vietnam. So under the Gulf of Tonkin Resolution, a president could send troops into an area, actively engage in war-type fighting without actually having a declaration of war. So it gave the president an enormous amount of power as commander-in-chief. It was hard to tell who the enemy was because many South Vietnamese believed that the Viet Cong and the communist way of life offered the best hope for national unity and a better future. You had the ARVN, or the American-backed forces of the Army of the Republic of Vietnam, and then you had the NVA, or the North Vietnamese Army troops. Those were the two sides, ARVN and NVA. North Vietnam began to send major combat units down the Ho Chi Minh Trail to South Vietnam in 1964. This was a path that went down to South Vietnam, a road. South Vietnam's government was disastrous at the time. Diem had been murdered and coup followed coup, so there was no stable government. So we're sending all these advisors, but we have no idea who the leadership is half the time. It keeps changing. Operation Rolling Thunder in 1964 was established. This was the systematic bombing of North Vietnam. LBJ hoped to stop the stream of soldiers and supplies along the Ho Chi Minh Trail, and this failed. The Viet Cong and the North Vietnamese Army utilized close-range fighting to make it hard for Americans to call in airstrikes for fear of hitting their own men and landmines. They also used booby traps. General Westmoreland, commander of the American forces in South Vietnam, stated that our goal was one of attrition, the idea of killing so many of the enemy that they no longer had the ability or the will to fight. And back home, U.S. officials were claiming that the United States was winning the war in Vietnam. In 1968, we called this the year of crisis. This is when Americans became very divided over the war. The Tet Offensive, Tet, the traditional Vietnamese New Year, occurred. This was the day where the North Vietnamese used this day to launch a nationwide attack on more than 100 cities and towns throughout South Vietnam, hoping to spark a popular revolt against the American-backed government. The offensive failed, but many Americans no longer felt the war could be won. There were a lot of journalists in Vietnam, and so this was being broadcast at home on our local television, on NBC Nightly News. They were seeing pictures from the Tet Offensive. So we had all these military officials saying that we are winning the war in Vietnam, and then the news broadcasts this whole thing on the Tet Offensive showing that this huge nationwide attack was able to be done, and it just really shook the confidence of the American people. Two divisions emerged in the United States. The Hawks supported American involvement and saw the war as part of a worldwide struggle against communism. The Doves were against American involvement, and they saw the war simply as a civil war among the Vietnamese people, which the U.S. had no business intervening in. The anti-war movement would grow. Student-organized marches on Washington and the Pentagon to end the war occurred. They burned their draft cards and sent them back to the Justice Department. There were televised Senate hearings on Vietnam. Also, scientists petitioned the president to stop using napalm, which was a firebomb, and Agent Orange, which was a highly toxic chemical used to kill plants and we know now cause a lot of health problems for civilians and soldiers. In 1968, Nixon was elected president, and there were many factors. First of all, LBJ had decided not to run for re-election. Also, Robert Kennedy, JFK's brother, had been assassinated, and he was considered the front-runner for the nomination for the Democratic Party. Number 3, Richard Nixon's campaign slogan, "Peace with Honor." He said Richard Nixon promised that we were going to be able to get out of Vietnam with our honor intact. Nixon and the end of the war. The events that led to the end of the war. First of all, you had Vietnamization. But this was Nixon's plan to build up South Vietnamese forces, making them do more of the fighting while gradually withdrawing American troops, much like the strategy that we have been using in Iraq and Afghanistan. American public then learned of the My Lai massacre. This is when American soldiers had killed 350 civilians in the village of My Lai in a spirit of revenge over heavy casualties suffered by their unit to mines and booby traps in the area. We'll learn more about this in class. There also was the invasion of Cambodia in 1970 to wipe out communist bases and to shorten the war, but this invasion failed. Then there was the disaster at Kent State University in which 4 students were killed and 10 were wounded when National Guardsmen opened fire on demonstrators after telling them to disperse. 30,000 young men would flee the country to avoid the draft, and another 20,000 deserted the military, so the war was becoming extremely unpopular. The average American soldier was only 19 years old. Many officers were killed or wounded by their own men. Drug use was commonplace also by 1970. After 2 weeks of bombing and pressure from China and the Soviet Union, the North Vietnamese signed a final peace settlement on January 27, 1973. Part of the agreement was the release of more than 500 American POWs from a place called the Hanoi Hilton, and that's where Senator John McCain was held for many years. Saigon would fall, though, on April 30th, 1975, to the Communists because the South Vietnamese army could not hold up against Communist attacks without American support. The results of the war. For Southeast Asia, many refugees would flee Vietnam to escape life under the Communists. These people are known as the boat people because they got in anything that would float and left Vietnam. Also, the Cambodian government fell to a ruthless communist group called the Khmer Rouge, who killed over 1 million people to rid the country of Western influence. And so they had genocide there in Cambodia. In the United States, the War Powers Act was passed on November 7, 1973. The goal was to prevent future wars from starting without congressional support. It requires the president to inform Congress within 2 days of any use of American troops in a foreign country. Troops must be withdrawn within 60 days if Congress does not support their deployment. So a president can send troops anywhere he wants. He just has to let Congress know within 48 hours where he has sent them, or he or she has sent them. And then they have 60 days to get congressional support for the action. If they don't get the support, they're supposed to, by law now, bring those troops home. There are many that feel that this is no longer constitutional because the president is the commander-in-chief. But until that is decided by the Supreme Court or contested in the higher courts, that is the policy. The American economy. The budget deficits rose and we had a huge national debt trying to support this war, and it led to an increase in inflation. 500,000 veterans suffered psychological problems. In 1982, the Vietnam Veterans Memorial in Washington, D.C. was dedicated to honor the 58,000 American soldiers who died. This concludes the Vietnam lecture.